More than 1,000 years ago, deep in the jungles of present-day Cambodia, a civilization arose. In the 12th century, 1 million people inhabited the largest city. They built the largest temple complex the world has ever seen, larger than the largest European cathedrals, surrounded by channel systems that could be seen from outer space. Mysteriously, they disappeared, abandoning cities and temples to the jungle. How was this greatness created, and why were these mighty structures left? In Cambodia, we find the remains of the early Khmer constructions. Constructions of a size that is visible from outer space, and to this day are still astonishing when we walk among them. Towering near the shores of Tonle Sap Lake, we find the world's largest and most spectacular temple complex, Angkor Wat. Angkor means city, and Wat means temple. Temple City. Behind a moat, which is 1.5 kilometers long and 1.3 kilometers wide, we find the temple area. A 190-meter-long causeway leads to the main entrance, built of sandstone coming from the Kulin Mountains 50 kilometers away. All the stones have been transported here on rafts along the Siem Reap River, and it is estimated that it took 50,000 workers around 30 years to build Angkor Wat. The 4.5-meter-high outer wall has entrances from every corner of the world, and the 235-meter-long and richly decorated main entrance is located to the west. From the main entrance, we see the temple in the distance. Flanked by railings on both sides, the 400 meters long avenue leads the visitors to the temple. The outer wall surrounds an area of 820,000 square meters. The main city and the royal buildings were located within this area, but all these buildings eventually disappeared because they were built of wood and leaves. Using stone for building was reserved for shrines and defenses. On the way to the temple, we pass two spectacular buildings that are believed to have served as libraries. All manuscripts, however, which were written on palm leaves, were destroyed due to wars, theft, and weather. But there are still traditions that have been handed down that tells us more about the life of over 800 years ago. Inscriptions in sandstone, carved in Sanskrit, which was considered the language of the Hindu gods for whom the temples were built. In the 12th century, the Khmer king Suryavarman II was inspired to crown himself as a god king by Hindu mythology. And as a god king, he created Angkor Wat as a copy of the Indian god's home, Mount Meru. Mount Meru has 5 mountain peaks that are surrounded by the ocean. The temple is built with 5 towers, 4 in the corners and 1 in the middle, surrounded by the huge moat. The towers are shaped like the bud of a closed-up lotus flower. The tallest tower is 65 meters. The temple is now part of the UN's World Heritage Site, which has secured funding for the restoration of Angkor Wat and other temples in the Angkor area. It has also motivated the Cambodian government to ensure and protect the site from decay and theft of the artworks. The actual complex consists of 3 levels which are high above the city. Around the temple we meet over 3,000 of these mythological creatures, known as devatas. No two are alike, each different hair, clothing, and expressions. Suryavarman ordered all the walls of the temple to be decorated with bas-reliefs that not only show the Hindu mythology, but also illustrate the wars of the Khmers. An 800-meter-long relief extends around the outer part of the complex. In one of the many scenes, we see Suryavarman appear greater than his subjects, sitting cross-legged on the back of an elephant wearing a crown and weapons, 15 umbrellas shading him from the sun while he is cooled by the servants' fans. Indian mythology came to the Khmer Empire with Indian traders. This exchange had great impact on the religious development among the Khmers and left its mark on the culture several centuries ahead. The Indian influence has left its mark on Angkor Wat's appearance. As it was a god king's home, it had to be as wonderful as possible. Numerous other temples are found in the countryside around the temple. It covers an area of at least 1,000 square kilometers, which is defined by an extensive infrastructure of roads, canals, and bridges. This has been the largest single settlement in the world history before the industrialization. Before we step out on the last level, we are taken through the corridors where the remains of Buddhist statues stand. It is clear that they are raised at a later time when the Hindu faith slowly has been displaced. The last steps leading up to the Holy of Holies is exhausting for even the most determined. The steep stairs symbolizes that it would not be an easy task to get into the realm of gods. Unlike other temple ruins in the world, the temples of Angkor are still active shrines that are used daily. The connection between the first and second level of the west consists of a cross-shaped gallery called Priya Pawan, Hall of 1,000 Gods. At one point, the hall housed several hundred Buddha statues. Most are now destroyed, stolen, or hidden from public view. The holes in the stones are believed to be the levers when the stone has been cut and put into place. The 4 depressions around the colonnades have most likely been filled with water. But what made it possible to build these temples in this dense tropical jungle? The answer lies partially in one of the most remarkable natural phenomena in the world. The Mekong River, which flows through Cambodia from the north to the south, receives the meltwater from the mighty Himalayas. Vast amounts of water flows toward the Mekong Delta, which is not able to direct the water into the sea. The stream is slowed to a halt, and then it turns and flows northward up the Tonle Sap River. The water leads into the Tonle Sap Lake, which becomes 4 times greater than normal around 4 months of the year. Each year, countless of square kilometers of forest and fields are flooded, creating the best conditions for fishing and growing rice. They took advantage of the moist lake bed to plant rice when the lake receded. The climate has also enabled rice harvesting 2 to 3 times a year. The ability to harvest several times a year has provided the financial strength to feed a huge population, building temples and cities, and lead wars. And in the same way as the Nile made Egypt, thus created Tonle Sap Lake, ancient Angkor. After Suryavarman's death in 1150, the kingdom went into internal strife. And to make matters worse, the people of Cham, from the current Vietnam, exploited the prevailing anarchy in Angkor. In 1177, they directed a fatal attack on Angkor from the Tonle Sap Lake, looted the Khmer capital, and executed the ruling elite. The future King Jayavarman VII gathered the Khmers and overcame Cham's army and navy. In 1181, Jayavarman ascended the throne. He was to become the greatest of all the kings of Angkor. On the ruins of the old city, Yasadarapura, Jayavarman founded the walled city of Angkor Thom, which means the Great City. The Bayon Temple became the new capital's geographic and spiritual center. In order to prevent future invasions, the city was surrounded by an 8-meter-high and 11-kilometer-long wall. As an additional insurance, they dug a moat in which they released crocodiles. This architectural achievement is comparable to Angkor Wat in the efforts to build Mount Meru surrounded by the ocean. The causeways that crosses the 100-meter-wide moat is each flanked by 2 rows of sculptures, 54 gods and 54 demons. A physical manifestation of the struggle for the sacred elixir of life. The Khmer's 9-square-kilometer big city flourished, and at its peak it was the capital of 1 million people. At each of the city's 5 gates, Jayavarman built towers 20 meters high. Each tower has 4 faces which gaze in the directions of the 4 corners of the world. All the gates are located exactly in the middle of the walls and lead the way directly into the center of the city where the Bayon Temple was built. Forest has overgrown the place where the city previously stood, and since everything was built of wood and leaves, nothing has survived the jungle environment for posterity. The Bayon Temple is unique among temples unique. The temple was the last great temple built in Angkor, and the only temple exclusively built as a Buddhist shrine. The temple itself has no walls and moats as Angkor Wat, as these are replaced by the surrounding city, but the temple follows the same mythological floor plan as Angkor Wat with 3 levels. All buildings are built so close that it leaves little space between them, which greatly shows the difference between Angkor Wat and Bayon. Just as Angkor Wat is impressive with its sheer size and open spaces, Bayon is impressive by being too many buildings in too little space. With its 52 towers and 216 slightly smiling faces, Bayon differs from other temples in Angkor. No matter where you are in the Bayon Temple, you are followed by the eyes of the image of the creator and ruler. After the discovery of a bust of Jayavarman, researchers believe that the faces are a mixture of Buddha and Jayavarman due to his status as a god king. As tradition prescribed, Jayavarman was a Devaraja, a god king, and identified himself as a Buddha and Bodhisattva, representing an enlightened and all-seeing being. In contrast to the reliefs at Angkor Wat, the reliefs at the Bayon Temple appear with tales from the life that they lived from the battlefields to the marketplace. More than 11,000 characters are depicted on the 1.2 kilometers of reliefs. Here's a scene of a naval battle where Cham warriors are seen in a boat above submerged dead Khmer fighters. A market scene in which goods are carried, food is weighed, and fish are cleansed. The Bayon Temple is a window into the past, where the reliefs are the key to a lost civilization. In 1296, just over 100 years after Jayavarman came to power, the Chinese diplomat Xu Daguan arrived. Xu Daguan had traveled overseas from China and sailed up the Tonle Sap Lake, where he had rode through the flooded forest to spend a year in the Khmer capital of Angkor Thom. For the luck of posterity, Xu held a diary which has survived all these years. In the diary, we can read that ordinary people lived in houses on stilts, which is very similar to the houses we can see around in Cambodia today. Xu wrote about religion, justice, kingship, war, agriculture, fishing, slavery, clothing, tools, trade, and much more. Xu described how ordinary people had roofs made of palm leaves, as tiles were only meant for sanctuaries. They cooked their meals outside, and there were no tables, benches, or pots in the homes of the ordinary people. Xu tells us about the people at Tonle Sap Lake and the way they kept livestock. He describes how people were fishermen when they were flooded and farmers when the water had receded. Along with the inscriptions and reliefs found in temples and tablets and monuments, Xu's diary is the main source of information about everyday life at Angkor. Xu is the only witness we have of this bygone civilization. No documentary evidence about everyday life has survived. Through his diaries, we get a glimpse of the heydays of Angkor. But during Xu's stay in Angkor, the civilization and culture had already caused for disaster. In the year 1431, the Angkorian period ended. The empire's collapse was finalized after 500 years of pomp and circumstance. The collapse was due to coincidences. The military success of the Mongol hordes had pressured the Thais south into the Khmer Empire. After many months of siege, Angkor surrendered. The kingdom was plundered and the civilization destroyed. The Khmer were already under pressure due to drought, causing the channels to silt up. In the end, the harvest for several consecutive years failed. At the same time, a new and gentler form of Buddhism emerged that did not require major temples. It shared the poverty of farmers and fishermen who were already exhausted by disasters. This was the end of the god kings, and Angkor was abandoned. The temples were now only used by Buddhist monks, and centuries went slowly by. The person who made the world outside Cambodia aware of Angkor's existence was the French naturalist and explorer Henri Mouhou. Mouhou has often been honored to have discovered Angkor in 1860, but Angkor was never lost. The location and existence of the temples has already been known by the Khmers. Through centuries, Angkor has been visited by missionaries, merchants, and soldiers of fortune. But it was only when Mouhou's records and illustrations was published after his death that Angkor was to be found on the world map. The publications brought the French school of the Far East to Cambodia, and in 1907 they cleared Angkor from the jungle, stabilized temples, and began the actual restoration. After the clearing of vegetation, the Bapoon temple, as we see here, was gently taken down due to its poor condition. All the stones were measured and registered in order to be laid out like a giant puzzle before reconstruction. But once again, fate would rear its ugly head. The dream of the blessings of the Khmer civilization suddenly played a role in one of the 20th century's worst crimes. After 400 years of internal strife and intermittent wars with Thailand and Vietnam, Cambodia became a French protectorate. With the excavation of Angkor, the insertion of a king and references to Angkor's heyday, the French got better control of the Cambodian population. But the French supremacy was never welcomed by the general public, and what the French had started to build, the resistant movement Khmer Rouge, took over. Angkor's grandeur and richness in the 13th century was mainly gathered through intensive farming, and according to the Khmer Rouge, Cambodia's former glory as a farming community had to be restored, this time in the form of a Maoist peasant revolution in order to be self-sufficient with food. In 1975, the Cambodian Holocaust arrived in the form of Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge, a madman's project fatal to both people and monuments. All foreigners were expelled. All work at Angkor was stopped and automatic death sentences was carried out against thousands of Cambodians who had worked for the French. Only 2 workers from Angkor were alive after the reign of terror was brought to an end. Where Angkor had developed agriculture over centuries, Khmer Rouge wished to convert the whole country in a few years by moving everybody from the cities to rural areas where hard slave labor awaited them. The project led to extreme poverty, hunger and death. According to the Khmer Rouge, a failed project was due to sabotage and intensified the hunt for arbitrary subversives. Artisans, clerks, monks, intellectuals, all were persecuted and imprisoned based on false allegations. Most victims were tortured and executed, and their maltreated bodies were scattered all over Cambodia in the so-called killing fields, some of which is to be found in the peripheral areas of Angkor. When the Khmer Rouge in 1979 was stripped of power by the Vietnamese, internal strife and occupation forces prevented all from coming back to Angkor for the years to come. Nearly 2 million people was killed during the war, almost a quarter of Cambodia's population. Today the survivors have returned to the cities and old businesses is resumed. Religion is no longer subject to the death penalty, and people are free to practice their faith in public spaces. When it finally was possible to return to Angkor, they stood face to face with one of Cambodia's biggest problems: landmines. Millions of landmines were spread across the country during the war, and nobody had maps of where they were laid. 25,000 people had their limbs amputated because of landmines. On average, 100 people a month die or get seriously injured by landmines. The ruins are now cleared of mines, but demining is still going on in the surrounding jungle, making movements outside the designated areas a live risk and enterprise. When the restoration of Bapoon could be resumed in 1995, archaeologists were met by the worst. The Khmer Rouge had destroyed all records of Bapoon's stone puzzle. Archaeologists faced 500,000 of individual pieces of stone that lay scattered around the temple, and no one knew where they belonged. After 2 years of measurements and computer simulations, the world's largest jigsaw puzzle is recorded and mapped. After the restoration of the foundation, the stones were put in their places one by one, and after 51 years of work, Bapoon is returning to its former glory. Shu Daguan had a strange story about these towers. If 2 men had a dispute, they were locked up for several days. After being released, one of the men would suffer from a disease and the other man would be in good health. Thus, right and wrong is determined by what is called a celestial judgment. A few kilometers away from Bapoon, we find the Phaya Khan Temple. The restoration is led by the World Monuments Fund, and they have a completely different set of problems to deal with. Originally, Preah Khan and the surrounding areas was a combination of city, temple, monastery and Buddhist university, a center for about 100,000 people built by Jayavarman. Here, too, the temple was surrounded by a city wall and moat. When the people left Angkor, everything was left to the jungle, which slowly covered the area. As Preah Khan was cleared around 1930, archaeologists decided to leave the place in a structured chaos. The decision was made from the wish to avoid recovery from guesswork and to respect the ruins as time has shaped them. But how much jungle should the World Monuments Fund allow to grow wild among the ruins, and how much must be removed to protect the buildings from collapsing? New vegetation is removed, preventing it from penetrating the ruins. Trees in danger of tipping over and damaging the ruins are felled. Others are supported in case of felling will damage the ruins. Statues have been removed to protect them from theft and decay. Buildings worthy of preservation is maintained or restored, and other buildings are neglected. The temple complex is kept in a balance between restoration of buildings and maintenance of the jungle in which the complex was discovered. The temple ruins in Angkor have survived invasions from the old Thai and Cham armies, Pol Pot and Khmer Rouge, theft, tourism and the tropical climate. They still stand as a symbol of a highly developed civilization's creative abilities. The most beautiful and exotic temple complex in the world.